Welcome back to Filling in the History. I am the amateur historian, and we have new digs now. So I keep saying we, it's just me here, but yeah, kind of a different situation here. Hopefully, this will be an improvement in some small way. But you can't improve the past, right? So that's what we're going to do. We're just going to tell you about it. So, welcome back to this new episode. We're going to have 3 parts today. We're going to be talking about section 27 of the Doctrine and Covenants, section 28 in the Doctrine and Covenants. But in between those two, we're going to be talking about a couple of very interesting documents and a bit of a story. Sometimes the story about the papers that we have is just as interesting as what they say. So, yeah, that's what we're going to talk about, those 3 things today. Section 27, some intermediary things, and section 28. So hopefully we're going to have a rip-roaringly good time today. So by way of introduction for our papers, section 27, the earliest copy that we have is from Revelation Book 1. It is shown as the 28th commandment, which was given in Harmony, Pennsylvania. And as you could probably see here, there's not a whole lot of changes to the text. Some spelling things, not a whole lot of major changes. Pretty clean copy coming into. Now, the originals are lost at this point in time, but we do have this as like what we printed from. And it's just interesting to note that some of these revelations didn't really have a whole lot of alterations to them, especially considering things like, the Articles and Covenants. You'd think they'd be going over those over and over again. But anyway, so not a whole lot of anything except for grammatical and spelling changes. It is chapter 28 in the Book of Commandments, and it is section 50, section L, section 50 in the Doctrine and Covenants in 1835, where we get some fun like other sources of this, which is fun. The Evening and Morning Star. This is a church periodical that was put out from 1833. In this case, actually has the same text as Revelation Book 1. And if you recall from a little while ago, the Painesville Telegraph came into our lives, and section 20 was in the Painesville Telegraph, and section 27, this section that we have here before us right now, is also attached to this. I guess they thought it was all one, and which is fine because it has to do with the sacrament, which, is something that we do every week in the church. So those are our sources. Now, what's interesting about this, and again, I'm sitting here thinking, oh, this will be an easy section to cover. I should probably just not think about that. So Revelation Book 1, we get a version of this, and you might notice it's a kind of short. Chapter 28 in the Book of Commandments, kind of short. Evening and Morning Star, kind of short. Painesville Telegraph, kind of short. And then you get to 1835, and you get to the Doctrine and Covenants, and suddenly it is far longer than it used to be. So there is a difference between kind of the original publications and what's in the Doctrine and Covenants. So if you read the current section heading for this, you'll note that it says, hey, I received part of this, and then the rest of it was received later in September. So this is another one of those revelations that was modified. And in this case, added to it. Modified would imply that they went back and changed language, but they definitely added something to it. And what I like about how they did it is this. So in let's just say the Revelation Book 1, or if you will, the Book of Commandments, the official stuff here. At the end of it, it says, I will drink of the fruit of the vine with you on the earth, with all those whom my Father hath given me out of the world. And instead of that, what you get is a description of all those whom my Father hath given me out of the world. So in the original is basically that, and then, be sure to be prepared, and then amen, and we're done. That's it. In the newer version of it, what we have is like a description of all these people who are taken out of the world, and also a kind of a reference to the New Testament, which we'll get in a second, called the armor of God. So I'll describe that in a moment. So instead of just saying, whom my Father hath given me out of the world, section 50 from the Doctrine and Covenants, what we now call section 27, elucidates a lot of these people. So who are they? Well, you have Moroni, which they say holds the keys to the stick of Ephraim, which we now interpret to be the Book of Mormon itself. The stick of Judah is what we would call the Bible. The stick of Ephraim is the Book of Mormon. So that's Moroni's job. And then he says, with Elias, and he has the key to bringing to pass the restoration of all things concerning the last days. You have John the Baptist, which had already come to them, who holds the keys of the Aaronic priesthood, so that's already been done. You have Elijah turning the hearts of the fathers to the children and the children to the fathers. He later on appears on the scene when the Kirtland Temple is dedicated. That's a whole section. That's a whole story in itself, but that actually does come to pass. He actually does manifest himself later on in the narrative. With Joseph, Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham, your fathers, quote unquote, your fathers. He actually talks about Michael or Adam, who's the father of all and the Ancient of Days. So this statement, Ancient of Days, comes originally, I believe, from the book of Daniel. And we, in the Latter-day Saint faith, believe that Adam, Michael, Ancient of Days, all the same person. So that's a unique thing for us, I believe. Maybe it's not unique to us, but we're the only faith that I know of that equates all of these together. Then you have Peter, James, and John, ordained and confirmed Oliver and Joseph to be apostles, along with the keys of the kingdom and the dispensation of the gospel. So another thing is, like I said, John the Baptist shows up, he gives his keys and ordains to the Aaronic priesthood. Peter, James, and John come and ordain to the Melchizedek priesthood. And for all intents and purposes, we kind of feel that sort of restored enough to get the church back on earth again after it had apostatized. So that's the narrative. Those are the people, apparently, that are listed out and described in a lot more detail in this section of the Doctrine and Covenants. So there's a bit of a change there in the papers. So the length of them is very different between the first four, we would say, Revelation book, Book of Commandments, Evening and Morning Star, Painesville Telegraph, and then everything coming afterwards is a lot more detailed about that. And we'll get into that in a little bit more. So that edition, with all of the length in it, all of the armor of God and sort of enumerating who these people are, is what we currently use in the 2013 edition, in the 1981 edition, and so forth. What's also interesting is that the manuscript history uses that version and even sort of explains, and I'll get to that in a moment, that the rest of it was received later on. So we have kind of a little bit of it, and then it says, well, instead of just these people and, prepare yourselves, we're going to really kind of expand on that. So that is the sort of papers introduction. There is also no section heading difference between 1981 and 2013, so the church made no change to this when the Joseph Smith papers came out, with the exception, of course, of removing the history of the church reference. So circumstantial introduction to section 27. Revelation book 1, the introduction from there says, a revelation to the church given at Harmony, Susquehanna County, state of Pennsylvania, given to Joseph the seer at the time that he went to purchase wine it for sacrament, and he was stopped by an angel, and that's not a joke, it's just two he's, spoke to him as follows, saying, and then you get a revelation. Book of Commandments and the 1835 edition, they make no mention of a heavenly messenger. It's kind of the same as a lot of other ones where it just says, like, hey, revelation given to Joseph Smith, date, place, that was it. From the manuscript history, we get a little more. So coming from draft 2, draft 1 doesn't really have anything here. It says, early in the month of August, Newell Knight and his wife paid us a visit at my place at Harmony, Pennsylvania. And as neither his wife nor mine had been as yet confirmed, it was proposed that we should confirm them and partake together of the sacrament. Before he and his wife should leave us, in order to prepare for this, I set out to go procure some wine for the occasion, but had gone but only a short distance when I was met by a heavenly messenger and received the following revelation, the first paragraph of which was written at this time, and the remainder in the September following. So a heavenly messenger kind of stops him on the way, grocery shopping, if you will, for wine, and sort of tells him a message. So this is another interesting one. This is not a Urim and Thummim. We're kind of going back to the early days where it was an angel, and we have an excerpt of that. Or I believe he probably wrote out everything that he had at the time, which apparently took a paragraph. Must have been a long paragraph. So what I love to is there's the section is given in the manuscript history, and that's how it is with all the history of the church, if I haven't made that clear. When you were to read, the history of the church, volume 1, like the way they published it, or even the manuscripts that they wrote that we're taking it from, they yeah, the whole section of the Doctrine and Covenants is there. And in the published versions, there's little notes too. Um, so after that's over with, so section is given. The aftermath of it is very interesting to me as well. It says, in obedience to the above commandment, we prepared some wine of our own make and held our meeting, consisting only of 5, vis-a-vis, Newell Knight and his wife, myself and my wife, and John Whitmer. We partook of the sacrament, after which we confirmed these 2 sisters into the church and spent the evening in a glorious manner. The Spirit of the Lord was poured out upon us. We praised the Lord God and rejoiced exceedingly. So this angel coming down was a meeting of 5 people taking the sacrament. You'd think it would be like a congregation. It wasn't. It was like a meeting at somebody's house taking the sacrament. So I thought that was very, very interesting. And this, again, is Newell Knight, as you recall, participated in a very much big, huge way in the first miracle of the church, which, as some of our commenters have noted, was an exorcism, if you want to use that term. A footnote to this, from the historical introduction of Documents, Volume 1. In 1833, John Murdoch and members of the church in New York, where he was preaching, made their own wine for this purpose. He recalled that, quote, by my advice, the sisters gathered currants and made wine for our communion. So this was immediately put into effect. Like, we're going to start making our own stuff. And I should also say that in the current versions of our scriptures, they will enumerate that in the Latter-day Saint faith, we actually use water instead of wine. But the whole point of this section is it doesn't really matter what you use. I know in some cases people will use Sprite or some sort of a soft drink that's been, sort of filtered and treated because maybe the water was contaminated or whatever the case may be. So anyway, this was taken right away. It's like, yep, we're not going to buy it anymore. We're just going to make our own stuff. And the Revelation kind of talks about it being from your enemies. Then we get into the Joseph Smith Papers historical introduction. So Documents, Volume 1. We get, again, what was in the manuscript history is almost rehashed. And then there's this quote, which I loved. The Revelation told Joseph Smith to use only new wine made by members of the church. Both the dating and the text of this revelation present challenges. The earliest extant copy in Revelation Book 1, the version featured here, dated it broadly to the year 1830, and John Whitmer placed it between revelations dated July and September of 1830. Despite Whitmer's placement, however, the versions published in 1833 in the Evening and Morning Star and the Book of Commandments specified the 4th of September, 1830 as the date. And further to this, in his later history, however, Joseph Smith said that the first paragraph of the 1835 text, quote, was written at this time, so early August of 1830, and the remainder of in the September following. Joseph Smith then affirmed that the first part should be dated August 1830 and the remainder September 1830, in which case the date of 4 September 1830 found the earlier printed versions may have reflected the date of dictation of the second portion. And so it's implied here that that second portion of it was also a revelation. Whether or not it was from an angel, we don't know. So yeah, a lot of very interesting timings here. For starters, I mean, they kind of downplay this in the text, but I'm visualizing this because I'm an amateur historian. But it's like, I'll be right back. I'm going to go get some wine. And he comes back, I guess, without anything and says, hey, an angel just told me we're not doing this anymore. I'm going to write that down if you don't mind. And everybody's like, okay. And then we'll have the sacrament. And it seems like everybody's like really cool about this stuff. But, we have a consolidated history, so I'm sure it wasn't like that. But anyway, just kind of a funny image, not to make light of it too much. But anyway, so let's talk about the content of this thing. So again, as I was saying before, there were a couple of changes made. There were two main changes made to this revelation since it was put in Revelation Book 1. So the original version that we get, the Revelation book, the Painesville Telegraph, Evening Morning Star, Book of Commandments, are all the same. In the second version that we get in 1835, the Doctrine and Covenants expands on those whom my Father hath given me out of the world, right? We have Moroni, Elias, John the Baptist, Elijah, Joseph, Michael, Peter, James, and John, so forth. But it also adds the armor of God. And what this is referring to, if you know the New Testament, Ephesians chapter 6, verses 11 through 18 in the King James Version of the Bible, talks about this imagery of adding the armor of God. So Revelation book 1 ends it with just, quote, "Wherefore lift up your hearts and rejoice, and gird up your loins, and be faithful until I come, even so, amen." That's the original ending. But what we get is put on the whole armor of God, and it's basically a reflection in a big way about Ephesians chapter 6. So you put on the helmet of salvation and the sword of truth and the shield of gird your loins with, the gospel, your feet with the gospel, the preparation of the gospel of peace. I don't have this memorized, but the point is, that is what is added into it. So we have these kind of 3 sections that are created because of this change made. Not sure about the details of those changes being made, but the original portion of it, which has a lot to do with the sacrament, and then we get sort of a a a meal or a coming together at some future day of some worthies from the Bible, as well as this putting on the whole armor of God is all part of section 27, but was not originally in like the Painesville Telegraph or in the Evening and Morning Star. And so just kind of another example of how revelation in the church works in a very different way than a lot of people might think of, in that it can be maybe expanded upon, and that there's no problem with saying, okay, I've received some of it here, and then maybe a month or 2 later, I received the rest of it, and that's what we published. So that is section 27, talking about the sacrament. An angel comes down, apparently, heavenly messengers, they say, and says, it doesn't really matter what you have as long as you do it with your eyes single to the glory of God. That's why today we use bread and we use water. And I know in some cases, if people have a celiac issue or some problem with gluten, you'll see maybe a small plastic cup with checks in it, or a gluten-free bread, or whatever it is. We really try to adapt it to whoever we're with. So anyway, some interesting things, some unique things perhaps about the church. And another one of those revelations that takes what I would say would to be a very commonplace thing, something we do every Sunday at church, and turns it into something rather interesting, like a heavenly messenger came down and kind of changed how we did all this. So there you go, section 27 of part 1. Stay tuned for our next part. We're going to be talking not about any revelations, but some intervening documents that are quite interesting. Some real estate going back and forth, and then a really interesting story about Newell Knight's history. So stay tuned. And we're back for part 2. And so I've just called this the papers in between 27 and 28. So what we get is 2 documents and a section of the Doctrine and Covenants as we have it today. So we get section 29. So 28 and 29 are sort of flipped in their order. Section 29 is actually a little bit more of a lengthy revelation, and that will receive its own episode next week. But for now, what I'd like to talk about is the 2 documents that we do have. The first one is a deed from Isaac Hale and Elizabeth Hale, dated on the 25th of August, 1830. And this is when Joseph Smith buys a house. This document is housed in the Church History Library. And so it's owned by the church. And the gist of it is, with all this legal jargon, this was a form, as you can see, that was filled out, by witnesses and, both parties and all this for the sale of a property. But in essence, what this is Joseph was able to make his final payment on a house that cost $200. What did he get for $200 in 1830 in upstate New York? Well, I'll tell you. And this, cost of real estate, I'm not taking this personally, but I'm just saying you got a whole lot for $200 back then. So he got 13 and a half acres, portion of land off of the Hale property. So this is Emma Hale's family, and Emma Smith's family, if you will, Emma Hale Smith. He got 13.5 acres of land. Including on that acreage was, quote, a frame home, a barn, and other improvements. So the historical introduction to this document, and this is coming from Documents Volume 1 in the Joseph Smith paper series, says the agreement required Joseph Smith to pay $114 by the 1st of May, 1829, and the balance of $86 by the 1st of May, 1830. Joseph Smith paid the first installment, but when he missed the second, Hale allowed him to pay interest on the payment and extended the due date, rather than rescinding the contract. By the 26th of August, 1830, the property was transferred to Joseph Smith. So, I don't know. I spent a little bit more than $200 on my house, and I don't have 13 and a half acres. And even by today's standards, I think, yeah, just real estate was a lot more affordable back then than it is now. Of course, there was a different connotation behind it. So what's the aftermath of this? So they made the sale happen. And I get this from, excuse me, the historical introduction again. It says, within a few days of concluding this transaction, Joseph Smith and Emma Smith departed Harmony, never to reside there again. They moved to Peter Whitmer Sr.'s home in Fayette, New York, staying there until they moved to Ohio in January 1831. In June of 1833, Joseph Smith and Emma sold the Harmony property for $300 to Joseph McCune Jr., the neighbor on the east side of the property. So it was theirs for all of 3 years, and they never really lived in it, which maybe it wasn't that big of a deal then, but that seems hard to me. The deed describes the property and the proper parties signed. It's witnessed according to New York state law. And so you get a lot of this like, oh, the property goes to this line and it goes over here and there's a tree over there and there's an outhouse here and all this kind of stuff. And they describe it. So I'm not going to get into all that detail with you. But if you flip the document over, the back side of the document confirmed that all was in order. Elizabeth Hale was very connected to the property. She understood what she was getting into because it was apparently her dowry interest. Now, if you recall, we've talked about this before. So when Martin Harris and Lucy Harris had a bit of their falling out, even before the Book of Mormon was a thing, when they were married, part of Lucy Harris's dowry was land that Martin Harris had. It was part of his wealth. And so as sort of a post-nuptial agreement in what we would call it today, she basically said, I want my dowry interest back because I don't want you to sell it for the printing of the Book of Mormon, which again, I think was probably maybe a smart move because he probably would have done that. But anyway, the same kind of concept is here with the Hale family, is that Emma Smith's mother, Elizabeth, basically said, I can see, I'm sober, I'm of my right mind, I'm signing this over, and sold it to her daughter and her husband. So I thought that was kind of an interesting connection there of a dowry interest. And there was a couple of, filing fees, $1 and something. Anyway, it's just not as much as it is now, let's just say. But anyway, all the fees were paid by Joseph Smith, and it was a fully executed deal. So that was their home. And this is a picture of their home we still have. There was a 2-story addition that was added later on, as you can see. But that was the frame house described, and 13 and a half acres on top of that for farming. And yeah, they actually owned it for 3 years. And usually that means it was maybe, given out to others to, make a profit thereby, but not them. They had to move right away. And I would imagine that was sad. So anyway, enough about homes and real estate. We're going to move on to a letter that was sent to Newell Knight and to the church in Colesville. So we sort of touched on this in the previous part, but a bunch of people got baptized and then they couldn't do any confirmations because Joseph was arrested and there was a mob and everybody was being a jerk and all this kind of stuff. So they couldn't finish. But what we get here is 9 pages, very small pages with larger handwriting on it, of a letter that was sent to these people that were in Colesville, New York, in 28th of August, 1830. It's from the original letter is gone, but what we get is this history called Newell Knight's history. And according to the source note, it said it was written in an unknown hand, which I thought was strange. Like, wouldn't it be in Newell Knight's hand? But here's what you get. From the source note, the handwriting of an unknown scribe, possibly Samuel Knight, who's the son of Newell and Sarah Colburn Knight, Samuel's wife, Carolina, or James McClellan, husband of Lydia Goldthwaite Knight McClellan. So that's the handwriting question. So the history of this document I thought was interesting. So you don't usually get entertained by a source note because it's like, oh, it's in Revelation book 1 and we've already talked about it. In this case, I just want to quote from this. It's a little lengthy, but I just thought it was really interesting. So from the source note of the Joseph Smith Papers, this is Documents Volume 1, it says, at the time this manuscript was created, McClellan, who had been married to Newell Knight from 1835 until his death in 1847, possessed documents of her late husband that are no longer extant, including letters, licenses, and certificates. It appears that those working under her direction created this manuscript by copying with some modifications from an earlier draft of Newell Knight's history, and by incorporating therein copies of these various documents. In the earlier Newell Knight history, from which this circa 1871 work was copied, Knight himself apparently used Joseph Smith's history, published serially in the Times and Seasons, as a framework for his narrative, at times copying this text verbatim. There are at least 3 similar contextually related versions of Newell Knight's history housed in the Church History Library. This circa 1871 version appears to be the basis for a condensed version published in 1883. Lydia Goldthwaite Knight McClellan appears to have taken a history of Newell Knight, possibly this circa 1871 manuscript, to the church historian's office. The historian's office journal mentions a history of Newell Knight in its 9 April 1872 entry and states that, and this is, I love this part, that in, quote, tin box containing history of Newell Knight was returned to Sister Knight. The circa 1871 manuscript was later found in a tin box in the basement of a house once owned by Knight's granddaughter in Provo, Utah. It was given to a descendant of Newell Knight. So to all you hoarders out there, some random tin box in the basement of a house in Provo, Utah, housed this document and a bunch of other things from Newell Knight, who experienced the first miracle of the church. I just thought that was just mind-blowing. It's fun. Again, this is a very long time ago that they found this tin box, but thank heavens for tin boxes, I guess, back in the day. And since then, I think it's been cared for a little bit better than being in somebody's basement. But footnote 1 from the source note on this as well says, in February of 1873, Lydia Goldthwaite Knight McClellan, boy, we love saying her whole name, don't we? Anyway, authored a preface to Knight's history and explained that the creation of this history was his, quote, dying request. She stated to her readers that she had done the best I could in compiling the work, although considerable portions of Knight's journal were kept on detached pieces of paper, and no doubt many interesting and valuable portions are lost. So for all you journal writers out there, keep your journals safe. Don't just do them on loose pieces of paper because you might lose a few. But anyway, so this book that we're reading from now apparently was Newell Knight's dying wish. I thought that was very touching. Okay, so the historical introduction to this letter we get from Documents Volume 1 says, in August, Colesville church members Newell and Sally Knight visited Joseph Smith in Harmony, Pennsylvania. During the night's stay, plans were made for Joseph Smith to meet with the church members in Colesville on a specified day in late August. The Knights returned to Colesville, and arrangements were made for the brethren and sisters to meet on that day, if possible, without letting our enemies know anything about it. However, the men who were to transport Joseph Smith to Colesville did not arrive in time for him to attend the meeting, and Joseph Smith and John Whitmer wrote this letter to explain their absence. And so the aftermath of this letter, so again, letters written, I'll get into the content of it in a second, but what happens after it's given? From the historical introduction, it says, likely on the 4th of September, the day he promised in the letter that he would arrive, Joseph Smith arrived in Colesville along with Hiram Smith, David Whitmer, and John Whitmer. Joseph Smith history recounts We that evening assembled the church and confirmed them, partook of the sacrament, and held a happy meeting, having much reason to rejoice in the God of our salvation and sing hosannas to his holy name. The animosity toward members of the Church of Christ in Colesville did not dissipate, however, and Knight recalled, quote, "It was not long after the brethren had left us when the mob began to gather, and threaten and abuse us in a most shameful and disgusting manner during the remainder of the day." So they did wind up getting together, but their sort of peaceful gathering was short-lived. So what's in this thing? Well, to put it briefly, there's apologies for not attending in person, explanation of why the delay is actually not given, which I thought was interesting. I mean, he was arrested and had court appearances, but he never actually says while he was late or why he was late to the meeting or why he didn't show up. He did acknowledge a lot of the issues that the saints were having, that they were being persecuted, that they had some issues, and um, in fact, they were sort of to meet maybe even secretly so that their enemies wouldn't molest them. So we get something from footnote 12, which I thought was interesting. Of this plan to keep the forthcoming meeting secret, Joseph Smith History records, quote, "We had called upon our Heavenly Father in mighty prayer that he would grant us an opportunity of meeting with them, that he would blind the eyes of our enemies so that they would not know us, and that we might on this occasion return unmolested. Our prayers were not in vain, for when within a little distance of Mr. Knight's, Joseph Knight Sr.'s place, we encountered a large company at work upon the public road, among whom were several of our most bitter enemies. They looked earnestly at us, but not knowing us, they passed on without interruption." So they were able to pass in peace, and that's how they made it to the meeting. So probably, if you want to call it, maybe a little bit of a miracle there, as described in this record. There's some other things about promises of their deliverance that's forthcoming, that the prophet's words, and this is talking about like ancient prophets, Old Testament, ancient time prophets would be fulfilled. Prophecies about a lot of perilous times, things coming in the future. And there's even a postscript. And it says this, quote, "P.S. Waited until Saturday morning and our friends have not yet arrived. Please send Polly's letter and also the priest's with William and oblige." So what does that mean? Footnote to this postscript says, "William is perhaps William Stringham, one of the Colesville converts and Newell Knight's brother-in-law. Joseph and Polly Peck Knight's 19-year-old daughter, Polly, had become the target of a local priest's tirade against the Church of Christ. According to Newell Knight's recollection, the priest, quote, had chosen my sister Polly as a mark for his abuse. But in an exchange of letters with Polly, quote, the priest was so decidedly used up that he was glad to give it up and back out completely whipped." So that's according to that. So apparently there was a bit of a priest targeted this 19-year-old young woman as, for some reason, his ire against the church. Who knows what. Anyway, so those are the two papers that we have. The next thing that we have is section 29. We'll get to that in another episode next week. It's a lengthy thing on its own. But just some kind of details about the history leading up to our next section, which is part 3 and section 28. So stay tuned for that. And we're back for part 3. This is section 28 of the Doctrine and Covenants. And jumping right in, the earliest version of this we get, once again, is in Revelation Book 1. And in Revelation Book 1, as well as in some other documents, section 29 actually precedes it, which is a lot more of a lengthy revelation than what we are talking about here today. It is called 30th Commandment, or a revelation to Oliver, is how it's described. In the Book of Commandments, it is chapter 30, and it is section 52 in the first edition of the Doctrine and Covenants in 1835. So there is also no difference in the section headings between 1981 and 2013, besides, of course, removing the history of the church references out of there. So not a whole lot of lengthy conversation about where we get this document from. Obviously, the originals are gone, but we have the Revelation Book 1. That's the earliest version of this that we have. There's some serious circumstantial evidence to this, and this is something that is cited quite frequently in the modern church, and I think is just kind of a good practice in general. Basically, like, okay, there's one leader, we're following one guy, right? Or one woman, like whatever it is, like we're just going to follow one leader at a time. So, for a circumstantial introduction, just to kind of give a full account of things, in the Revelation Book 1, we get a revelation to Oliver Cowdery, his call to the Lamanite, etc., given at Fayette, Seneca County, state of New York. So there's a combination of things here. There's something about Hiram Page that we'll get into in a second. Hiram was one of the 8 witnesses to the Book of Mormon, and then also Oliver Cowdery was called on a mission to what is called the Lamanites. So that is a sort of Latter-day Saint term for Native American tribes. We have a belief through the Book of Mormon that a lot of the descendants of the original Nephite, Lehite, Lamanite tribes still exist today. They've mixed and mingled and traveled all over, but there's kind of a remnant there, and that's what we refer to as Lamanites. I think for a long time the church referred to all Native American tribes as Lamanite, and I don't believe we do that anymore, but it definitely was a major term for a long time in church history. Manuscript history, we actually get from draft 1 this time. So going along, and we're talking about, buying houses and all this other kind of stuff. But then we get to this, having to do with this section. To our great grief, however, we found that Satan had been lying in wait to deceive and seeking whom he might devour. Brother Hiram Page had got in his possession a certain stone by which he obtained to certain revelations concerning the upbuilding of Zion, the order of the church, and so forth, but which were entirely at variance with the order of God's house, as it is laid down both in ancient and in our modern scriptures, and our late revelations. As a conference meeting had been appointed for the 1st of September, I thought it wisdom, not to do much more than converse with the brethren on the subject until the conference was or should be held. Finding, however, that many of the brethren, especially the Whitmer family and Oliver Cowdery, were believing much in the things which were set forth by this stone, a few of us got together and succeeded in obtaining the following revelations, which gave us much information on that and other subjects connected to our respective duties. So the conference is held, and the background of this, again, is that Hiram Page finds his own stone and starts receiving revelations from it. And the Whitmer family and Oliver Cowdery is like, yeah, I mean, that tracks, which kind of makes sense. I mean, we've talked about seer stones in the past, the Urim and Thummim in the past. This kind of puts it together. Now, this is a history written way later. Joseph seems very calm about this. I don't know how he was at the time. There's not a whole lot of description of an emotional state of things. But what I kind of like about the early church is they're like, it's a good question. What do we do? And so they asked, received a revelation, and that's what we get, more or less kind of taking this down. So what's the aftermath of this? So they have their meeting, and then again from draft 1, it says, conference at length assembled, the subject of the stone, etc., was brought up, and after considerable discussion, reasoning, etc., and investigation, Hiram agreed to renounce the stone and its author, and the brethren unanimously agreed to renounce them also. So it doesn't seem like this was Joseph getting up and saying, I am in charge, do what I say. It was kind of like, I don't know, what do we think? Like, let's talk about this. And apparently had a considerable discussion and reasoning about it, which I thought was kind of cool. And this revelation comes from that. The historical introduction from Documents Volume 1 gives us, this revelation was a response to actions by Oliver Cowdery and Hiram Page that raised the question of whether Joseph Smith was the only one authorized to deliver revelation to the church. The question first arose in summer of 1830 when Oliver Cowdery commanded Joseph Smith to change a passage in Articles and Covenants, a document outlining the basic beliefs and practices of the Church of Christ. So, kind of going back to that, we mentioned this a couple of episodes ago, but yeah, there was kind of a heated debate, and the language that Oliver wrote to Joseph was not like the kindest thing. again, kind of makes sense. Oliver was part of putting together the Articles and Covenants and was definitely a part of the group that like raised their hands to ratify it in that June of 1830 meeting. So, a little bit more about that, actually, just to kind of give maybe a sense of the debates that could have been going on around this stone. We get weeks later, he sent a letter ordering Joseph Smith to make a correction to the document. According to Joseph Smith history, Cowdery objected to the requirement that candidates for baptism truly manifest by their works that they have received the gift of Christ under the remission of their sins. And he wrote to Joseph Smith, quote, I command you in the name of God to erase those words, that no priestcraft be among us. In response, Joseph Smith traveled from Harmony, Pennsylvania to Fayette, New York to persuade Cowdery and the Whitmers that they were mistaken. According to Joseph Smith's later account, it was not, quote, not without both labor and perseverance that he could, quote, prevail with any of them to reason calmly on the subject. So some feelings there. Finally, with support from Christian Whitmer, Joseph Smith convinced Cowdery and the Whitmer family, quote, that they had been in error and that the sentence in dispute was in accordance of the rest of the commandment. So there was a lot of feelings, it seems like, behind this. And so I have to imagine that the same kind of thing happened in this case with Hiram Page. So we get a little further into the historical introduction for the set of documents, Volume 1. The second challenge to Joseph Smith's authority, came in early September when Joseph Smith and Emma Smith moved from Harmony to Fayette and found to their great grief that Brother Hiram, or Hiram Page, had got in his possession a certain stone by which he had obtained two certain revelations, all of which were entirely at variance with the order of God's house, as laid down in the New Testament as well as in our late revelations. With another conference of the church approaching, Joseph Smith initially thought it wisdom not to do much more than to converse with the brethren on the subject until the conference should meet. But upon finding that many, including Cowdery and the Whitmer family, supported Page, Joseph Smith, apparently with Cowdery's encouragement, decided it would be best to inquire of the Lord concerning so important a matter. Wherefore the conference convened, Before the conference convened, Joseph Smith dictated the revelation featured here, which addressed the issues surrounding both Cowdery's role and the things set forth by this, or Page's, stone. And this is another thing about the relationship between Oliver and Joseph that I find so interesting. Joseph is a revelator. He is the prophet. He's the first elder. And yet Oliver has to say, like, Joseph, you really should get a revelation about this. And it almost seems like he's like, well, I don't know. And he's like, no, go get a revelation about it. Like, that's the kind of commonplace faith that they had about this. Like, just go to the Lord and get a revelation about it. And they did, and that's what we get. So yeah, that's what's kind of surrounding this. There's what I would say, like a legitimate claim, like, hey, if you have a stone, why can't we have a stone? I think that's a good question to ask. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. So what's in it, right? What's the content of the revelation? Well, in a way, it reaffirms that the Articles and Covenants, what we now call Section 20, were actually valid, and that nobody should be acting outside of that structure, which I would add again is the MO of the church today. Like, we go back, like, we definitely follow the Articles and Covenants. We, general church authorities, whatever you want to call it, definitely follow that. And only one at a time can lead. And Joseph was the presiding authority at that time. It's also interesting, as a footnote to this, there's this moment of like, until I shall appoint unto him another in his stead. So this idea of like, there's probably going to be a successor to Joseph Smith is kind of briefly mentioned here. There is a call here for Oliver Cowdery to preach a mission to the Lamanites, or to Native American tribes. And in this case, you would have just gone a little further west and you would have been there. And something that is referred to quite a lot in the church, this is one of those things that's referred to quite a lot in the church, is that Oliver is to talk to Hiram Page privately. I think the scripture says, between he and thee alone, to discuss the stone. Don't make a big show of it. Don't tear him down in public. Like, take him aside and do it, I guess, with a little bit of respect is how I would say that today. And apparently Hiram denounces the stone, others agree, and it is apparently destroyed. And the idea after all of the rest of it is that you are to settle everything by the articles and covenants of the church. And so this is, I would say, the beginning of saying, refer to the handbook, right? Or the beginning of saying, look, there is only one person who has the right to do such and such a thing. And so the reason why I said earlier he or she is not some comment on priesthood or anything. What it really is like, look, if your teacher for Sunday school is him or her, they're in charge. Like be cool about that. The bishop is the bishop. The Relief Society president. This now applies to Emma later on. Like she's the one in charge of the Relief Society, and she should be the one presiding and sort of do that, rather than having a bunch of people running around doing different things. So the church structure is very hierarchical that way, in that it's like, okay, who's in charge? Who has the keys? Who's presiding here? Those things are very well noted, and one of those things, one of the reasons why we raise our hands for common consent in the church. So this is something this section's very, very, very important to just the order of how church government works even to this day. And I would argue even back then. Now we don't really know what was in these revelations because again, they were destroyed. It would have been interesting to know what they were, what they were saying. So we do get much later on some people recounting this. Again, this is future state stuff where they're kind of looking back years later. But I did get something here from footnote 5, which says, Newell Knight recalled that Page, quote, had quite a roll of papers full of these revelations, and many in the church were led astray by them. Ezra Booth, who wrote a series of antagonistic letters denouncing Joseph Smith after leaving the church in the fall of 1831, explained his understanding of Page's seer stone. Quote, he found a smooth stone upon which there appeared to be writing, which when transcribed upon paper disappeared from the stone, and another impression appeared in its place. This, when copied, vanished as the former had done, and so it continued alternately, appearing and disappearing. In the meanwhile, he continued to write until he had written over considerable paper. It bore most striking marks of a Mormonite revelation and was received as an authentic document by most of the Mormonites, till Smith, by his superior sagacity, anyway, I think I'm saying that right, sagacity, discovered it to be a satanic fraud. George A. Smith later stated that the stone was black and explained that on it Page saw, quote, certain characters that he copied down as revelations. Emer Harris also called that Page's stone was black. He added that it was destroyed. Very interesting description. So, boy, I want to quote movies on this one because I feel like I've seen that kind of thing of like a stone and like letters appear and once they're written down, they disappear and then new ones come up. Anyway, very cinematic, very, very interesting that way. But that's a description of the stone that was in argument. A little bit more from the historical introduction, and then we'll close it out. It says, a revelation earlier that month had affirmed that church elders would establish the New Jerusalem in America as an apocalyptic fulfillment of both biblical and Book of Mormon prophecy. After other men were called to accompany Cowdery, the group of missionaries left in late October of 1830. So that is the missionary force, that part of the revelation that says, Cowdery, you're going to go on a mission. That wound up being a group of individuals that went off to serve missions. They kind of went west, which again is what they would have called either, quote, Lamanite territory, Indian territory, we would now call Native American territory or native territories. And this usually was kind of beyond Ohio. A lot of states still hadn't been formed yet because this is 1830. So there you go. That is sections 27 to 28, a little bit intermediary to kind of explain. I hope what this is doing as far as filling it in is maybe showing like, hey, this is how things worked back then. But what I kind of like to find is, yeah, we still do that to this day. You still have to sign a ton of paperwork, pay your bills, there's interest payments, all that kind of stuff. Some things just never change. I just wish I could have bought a real estate property for $200, but that's for another time. But anyway, until then, this is the Amateur Historian. I hope you have enjoyed this. Thank you so much for the comments. I know a few of you have come back. It's been really fun to interact with you. If there's anything that I'm missing or whatever, please feel free to shout it out. But until next time, we will fill in some more history for your history-loving pleasure. Have a good week.